Okay, so Chris, since you're holding the microphone, I'm going to just start with you.
Great.
So one of the things that we've heard about is the entrepreneurial learner's permit, which sounds like it could be something that's good for the economy, good for business. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's something that actually came out of my committee, and the entrepreneurial learner's permit is essentially that what we found when we looked at the impact that our fees, our regulations, and things have on small business, really small business, green shoot, really beginning level business, was that they were onerous. So what we try to do with the learner's permit is take some of that off their shoulders, waive some of those fees and some of the financial burdens that they have to deal with, so they can just essentially focus on R&D, focus on marketing, focus on the things that are actually going to build their business in the short term. So this is, and again, this is an idea that was introduced by Senator Scott France, who is the ranking Republican member on our committee. So our committee, we have what we call bipartisan screening. So we have both Democrats and Republicans in screening going through these bills. So I think as a working group, I think we're doing pretty well with some of the ideas we're putting out. And I think that this idea definitely has some real promise.
And have we seen some uptick in the number of small businesses as a
well,
result?
it hasn't been passed.
Okay.
But this is what's that? Well, it's got some momentum. I was happy to see that it got out of finance. I think that the issue has been Small Business Express has been a program largely designed to help small business, but I just never felt that we were really doing enough to drill down to really capture as many people that are interested in the state of Connecticut as starting a small business in a way that's where they're really one step behind because of excessive regulation. So this is I think this is very promising. It's a bill I think is got a lot of promise behind it, 100%.
Great, thank you. Representative Lavielle, you mentioned that you're on the Transportation Committee. I think if I polled the audience, I suspect I would hear complaints. Sorry, we will have complaints here about the state of transportation in the state of Connecticut. Can you share anything with us on where things stand with respect to roads, tolls, trains, improvements, things like that?
Sure, and I could take all day, but I won't do that, I promise. I do want to say before I start that what Chris has just talked to you about in the Commerce Committee and the bipartisan working atmosphere there, it really was, I enjoyed my time there immensely. It could serve as a model for the whole legislature. Yeah, well, but they do a great job, and Chris is now the senior chair, so anyway, thank you. Transportation, actually yesterday, the Transportation Committee heard from the president of Metro North. Joe Giulietti came to speak to us. And the one thing I will say about that conversation was that they have made great strides in improving safety. I found what he had to say about that convincing. Performance is another matter, because it depends both on infrastructure, which is all owned by the state of Connecticut, and Connecticut is responsible for those investments, and Metro North, the operator, which operates under a contract with the state of Connecticut that includes no performance standards and no penalties for not meeting them because there aren't any. So that is a very difficult catch-22 situation that has another 30 years to go. It's a very long contract, and so far no one has found a satisfactory way to deal with that. So that gives you sort of an idea of where Metro North is. But infrastructure, I think, is the primary issue that we are facing right now as a state. The governor, as most of you know, I think, put forth a sort of plan for the next 30 years in terms of the projects that could or should be completed in order to completely modernize our transportation infrastructure and make it even adequate, with a 5-year ramp up, which is sort of getting all the design and engineering for those projects going. So far, there are recommendations for funding the first 2 years of that 5-year ramp up. The rest is indeterminate for the moment. The governor has appointed I can't remember how many members, but an outside commission to think about this and make a recommendation by the end of the summer in terms of how to pay for it. Of course, 30 years is a long time. The House and Senate Republican caucuses put forward a plan which would produce about $67 billion in bond funding over the 30 years, which would be done by reallocating a portion of our regular general obligation bonds to transportation each year for that period of time. That's one plan that is out there. For the rest of the plans, we wait. It's complicated. It will take a lot of thinking. The one item that comes up continually for discussion is tolls. That is something that arouses a great deal of negative sentiment in this part of the state. It's not something that I support. It's not something that a lot of us support, but some do. A couple of things I would say about tolls. One is that there are some very severe federal restrictions on just plunking down a normal set of tolls, meaning you pay the same toll no matter what time of day it is, on any highway in Connecticut. That's very hard to do just on an existing highway. We really don't have permission to do it. We did receive an authorization from the federal government to do a pilot on what is called congestion pricing, which means charging a different amount at different times of day, or just allocating one express lane, things like that, because the point of that is supposed to be to manage traffic patterns. However, what the governor's budget director has said several times in testimony is that the solution that would likely be most attractive to Connecticut in terms of regulations and possible support would be the one likely to generate the least amount of revenue. So from my perspective, tolls do not seem to be the answer to the situation. To execute the governor's plan fully, we understand it's about $100 billion over the 30 years. So we have a long way to go. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Morris, I have a little bit of a rambling question, so bear with me. You lead the Black and Puerto Rican caucus in the state, and one of the buzzwords these days is diversity and inclusion. And it's a buzzword, but nevertheless, it's very real. I mean, certainly in the accounting profession, we are working very hard to try to attract more minority students into the accounting profession, which really tends to be an uphill battle, because what we're finding is we need to really educate the students about the profession by middle school. So bringing it back to your role, what does the caucus do? Do they work at all with students to try to inspire them to careers in the legislature or politics or what have you? And is there anything that the corporate community can do to try to work on this issue of diversity and inclusion?
How many parts to that question?
That's a warm-up question.
Okay. First of all, Black and Puerto Rican caucus is comprised of, we have 5 members in the Senate, 21 in the House. There's a women's caucus, which primarily focuses on women's issues to make certain that we're protecting women. So our caucus similarly advances policy that advocates or ensures that the rights of blacks and browns are addressed and at least heard whenever we're considering policy. I like the fact that you asked the question from the standpoint of diversity, because whereas it's a separate caucus, everything that we promote is about inclusion. It's advancing and helping everyone understand that to leave blacks and Latinos out of your policy, out of your day-to-day working, out of commerce, there's a great disadvantage to the state of Connecticut. Working on the Human Services Committee, and Terry knows as well, we deal with some very, very tough, gripping your heart types of issues that go year after year after year, that quite frankly, they hurt us as a state. The expenses that we pay, they're unsustainable, and primarily because we have not worked as hard to empower, to include people that are black and Latino. And that is to say that we're not even just focusing on issues that deal with people in poverty, which would not be exclusive to blacks and Latinos. So, and I'm kind of getting around to your question in a different way, because do we work with students in interning? No, what we do is we raise the issue that education is the great equalizer. So for so long, one of the premier pieces of the agenda for the Black and Puerto Rican caucus is to say, let's move from talking about an achievement gap to having real policy that deals with it. So that a lot of the education reform that happened 2 sessions ago, the Black and Puerto Rican caucus, after the governor came out with his bill and House and Senate leaders, sat down with primarily, we're all urban legislators. In fact, many of us are educators. We came to the table and were able to make the compromise to come out with a bill that really focused on what do we need to do as a state to make certain that we're investing in all of our human capital. So that's been a major piece for ours. With inclusion, well, unfortunately, because we're included in the numbers, the lowest numbers of performing, we're also included blacks and Latinos in the highest numbers that are represented within the judicial system. So hence, obviously for years, judicial reform has been a major part of our agenda because the budget dollars that we're spending on prisons and incarceration, again, is something that is unsustainable and has an impact upon us in each of our individual communities, within the state and the nation at large. The dollars that we spend upon our budget, we're hoping that we were able to shut down a few prisons. We got so tough on crime that it only impacted 2 segments of our community. So we focus there, but the one I want to go to, because it answers your question, I think, the best. Especially because you asked the question about corporate. What could the corporate community do? Because we've always done the education piece, and that made sense to people. We've always done the judicial piece. That made sense to people. But why does a kid want to go to school and get an education anyway? Because he expects to get a good job, to have a career. He expects that maybe he might have an entrepreneurial opportunity. So the one piece where the equity and inclusion has not been afforded to its greatest extent actually is within the business community. So we've added a 3rd leg to our agenda this year. We call it economic equity. The state of Connecticut has a program. It's called Small Business Set Aside. It's been in existence since, I think, the early 80s. Whereas 25% of the dollars that the state spends, whether through agencies, through quasi-public agencies, 25% of it should go to small businesses. Small business is anyone who's got revenues $15 million and below. Makes good sense. You want to build small business, right? Well, within that framework, there's also 6.9% that should be dedicated towards minority businesses. Minority businesses include women-owned businesses. Come to find out, there's no rhyme or no reason that when we put this in place, we exempted municipalities. So all the schools that are getting built and other dollars that are taxpayer dollars are exempted from that program. So small businesses that would have an opportunity to start, they don't get that opportunity. Women-owned and minority businesses, they don't get that opportunity. So this year, a major focus of ours is to remove that exemption. Because we failed doing that throughout the entire state. I think it was 2012, there was over like $22 billion in state spend. By the time they got through with the exempting all the municipalities and all, there was only $300 and some odd million went to small businesses, which some of you in this room may be small businesses. You may have had an opportunity to take advantage of that. It was products, goods, and services, and only $63 million went to minority businesses. So in terms of inclusion, this works, and I would encourage everyone who has a business, whatever you can do, whatever you can do to create opportunities for people of color, that there's a greater likelihood that that is a parent that is, rather than being underemployed and working 2 or 3 jobs and doesn't have the time and opportunity to spend with your child to get a good education, whatever you can do to provide those opportunities, you are doing something great for the state. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Representative Wilms, one of your efforts we're aware of are your efforts to reform the education cost-sharing formula. Why don't you talk a little bit about that and tell us if a simple fix exists for that?
Well, if there is one, we've yet to find it. Well, yes, I mean, I think we all understand here in Norwalk that we as a city are shortchanged. We're the 6th largest city in Connecticut, and in terms of the funding that we get back from the state to support education, I think we're ranked number 40 or 50. You know, the state has a policy goal where the state supports half of the income and then the town supports the half of the income. And in Norwalk, we fund from our local taxpayers about 92% of our education. And as we know, we're an alliance district. We have 51% of our students are at free or reduced lunch. We have some, you know, socioeconomic, we're also in DRG Group H, which the educators in the room know what that means, but there's A through I. I is like Bridgeport and Hartford, and we're in H. We're in a group just above that. So we have some real challenges, and we need help. And certainly we in Norwalk have been doing more than our fair share to help our schools. Why are we being shortchanged? Well, I actually figured out the formula, this ECS formula. I actually sat down one weekend and figured it out. I'm not going to bore you with it. I was bored with myself after I figured it out because there's all these calculations and everything else. Bottom line is this. The state believes that we're rich. And we're rich because we have high property values as determined by our net grand list. So the value of the grand list weighs heavily in that calculation and severely reduces what we get. There is a component that talks about income. And as we know, we're an asset-rich community, but we're an income moderate town as well. So what I proposed, as many of you know, I proposed a bill to change the formula so that it gives more weighting to income and less to town wealth. And then that would result in us getting a lot more money. I'm also realistic enough to know that if I'm proposing more money for us and it means taking money away from someone else, that's probably not going to get all that far. So what I propose with my approach is to apply it to new money. So everyone keeps what they get, nobody loses anything, but in the future, if there is new money set aside for ECS, we would get a larger share of that. And so I proposed that to the Education Committee. It didn't go anywhere. I got a lot of support actually from Stamford Mayor Martin Anderson. He testified right after me, and he actually gave me some helpful tips for my next testimony. But we're going to continue, with that approach, and do something that ultimately is just it's fair for Norwalk.
Great, thank you. Representative Wood, you have been selected to serve on a panel charged with developing a blue plan for Long Island Sound. Can you tell us what that is and what its economic impact will be?
Yes and no. It's actually not a panel. I was just one of the lead introducers of the bill. So it's something that was developed by James Albus, Representative James Albus, who's co-chair of the Environmental Committee, and Senator Ted Kennedy, who's also co-chair of the Environmental Committee. And with my environmental background, I started a nonprofit environmental group in 1990, the Darien Environmental Group. That's still going. I was president of the Darien Land Trust for 5.5 years and on the board for close to 10 years. And I'm also on the Trust for Public Land Connecticut Advisory Board, formerly board chair. So it was because of my environmental background that I was asked to be one of the lead co-sponsors of the bill. So it's not a panel, but it's a bill that I'm very excited about and was very pleased to be asked to be one of the co-sponsors of it. It looks at Long Island Sound and how we preserve it, how we conserve it. It charges DEP with setting up an entire plan for the preservation of Long Island Sound, for its health, looking at how we enjoy it, how we recreate on it. So it's a holistic plan that's never been done in the state before, which we're very excited about. So it's passed out of the Environment Committee. It is a House bill. Passed that. Things fly around. With the thousands of bills that get introduced every year, we vote on about 400 to 500 in each chamber. And sometimes you lose track of, especially we're in the last 3 weeks. 3 weeks and 1 day left of the legislative session. Not that we're counting, but there's a lot happening. And anyway, it's very exciting. I think so many of us are drawn to this area because of the water. And historically, the water and the harbors, Norwalk Harbor is a classic example of, it was the driver of economic development in the 1700s. And it's also where the British tried to beat us, and damn, they didn't. So anyway, thank you.
And so we're here to talk about it, right?
Yes, so we're here to talk about it. Remember it proudly.
Thank you. Senator Duff, it's truly an honor to have Senate leadership from Norwalk. How has your first year been being the Senate leader, and what does that mean for Norwalk?
Thank you, Terry, and good morning, everybody, again, and thanks for having me. You know, it's a real honor to be chosen by your colleagues to be the Senate Majority Leader, and to be able to be in leadership to not only move the state forward on things that are important, but also to help your communities in which you serve. I think that for me anyway, in the first year, it's been a lot different because, as I mentioned earlier, that I'm not on a policy committee this year, and for my time in the legislature, I've always been on the Energy Committee. I used to be on Appropriations for 10 years. I've been on Regulations Review Committee and other committees, and so this year, kind of at a different level, at a different perch, I guess, not being on a policy committee, especially the first few weeks of the legislative session, as I was getting kind of in my area and getting settled in, you see everybody running in different directions, going to their committee meetings and like whirling dervishes, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, what's going on? You know, and but then of course things start settling in very quickly, and you know, we have a new Senate President, and he had been Majority Leader for a number of years, and I think for me, it is the pace of the job is probably undescribable in a way. It's a pace that's probably 10 times more than I had as a rank and file senator. And as I was speaking to our former colleague, Representative Larry Cafaro, he said even when he was the deputy minority leader, and he was right next to the minority leader in the House, Bob Ward, he never saw what the job was like until he actually got into the job in leadership. And so from my perspective, it is a job that is exciting, is very rewarding. There's an opportunity to help the district. There's an opportunity to put your stamp of approval on a number of things that happen throughout the state. And you're in the room for lots of decisions that maybe you might not have been in the past. But that's also to say that, you know, you also have to lead a caucus. So you're not a leader as a dictator. You're not a leader as somebody who says this is what you have to do. You have to do an awful lot of listening. You have to let and give members of your caucus space to be able to put their ideas forward, to be able to let them bring forth ideas or plans that they think are important, maybe that they think are important to their districts, and be able to then at some point say, okay, this is the direction we need to bring everybody in so that we can build consensus and we can move forward on important items. So it has been really exciting. I mean, it is only the first year, but I will say that it's an honor to be there, and I really have enjoyed it tremendously.
Great, and it's an honor for Norwalk as
Thank
well.
you.
Thank you. Okay, so now we are going to, let's see, where's Brian with the microphone? Okay, we're going to open it up for questions, and what we would ask is that you stand up, identify yourself, and ask your question, and if you have a particular legislator that you'd like it directed to, you could say that as well.
Good morning, David McCarthy, member of the Norwalk Common Council. Thank you all for being here, certainly, and thank you all for the work that you do on our behalf up in Hartford. My question, I think, goes largely to Senator Duff, and if you give me a little leeway, it's a little bit rambling, but I think it's probably a number of questions that are of interest to the people in the room. Specifically to your bill, Senate Bill 1, I probably could spend most of the morning asking questions about that, but really my first question is, why I can't do that, because it was voted out of committee without the text of the bill even being available, I believe, to the members, and certainly not to members of the public. So I'm hoping you can help us to understand, why that happened. And other bills like Senate Bill 946, which I believe was voted out of committee, without a public hearing on most of the changes that, I believe also included, $2 billion of new taxes for the state. And then with respect to the, we speak a lot about the budget and increases in taxes. I'm suddenly more concerned that the budget and the cap specifically has been redefined so that now there are almost, and correct me if I'm wrong, $2 billion in retirement benefit contributions that have been, sort of redefined as off budget so that they don't count towards the spending cap. And $2 billion is significant even to me. If that money's being spent, it's coming from taxpayers, but yet it's, I guess, not in the budget or it doesn't count under the cap. And those things all together are kind of leading me, and I know other members of the council for this city, to be confused, concerned, and a number of other adjectives that I won't bore you with. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to, are people in the audience familiar with Senate Bill 1 and Senate Bill 946? Nod. Okay, so if, can you just give like a brief overview of what's included in the bill, and then we'll get to answering the question.
Sure.
And I'm going to refill my coffee after that.
Thank you, Terry. And thank you for the question. Yeah, Senate Bill 1 was a bill that was put forward by our caucus back in January. Had a number of sections in it that, again, dealt with car tax, that dealt with regional cooperation, that dealt with a number of other issues that were important to members of the caucus. And, as I said just a second ago, there are bills that are presented out there that at times are meant for debate and discussion, and as Majority Leader, I have to give members of the caucus room to be able to have these kinds of debates and discussions about issues that they feel are important. And as I had also said many times, that what came out of when Finance Committee, it started in Planning and Development, which is probably a mistake. It should have started in the Finance Committee. And what ended up coming out of Senate Bill 1 was completely different than how the bill was originally proposed. And actually, if anybody had asked me that, I would have said that it would come out different, and it did. The basic part of it, for us anyway, that affects us. So I'll give you two or three things. One is that it caps the car taxes, and it doesn't really affect us down here. It affects a lot of other cities around the state. And this has really been a vexing issue for many communities around the state, because the car tax is a tax that is onerous. If you have say a 2005 Honda in Waterbury, you're going to pay a lot more money than you would get a 2005 Honda in Norwalk or Darien or New Canaan or wherever. And so there's a fundamental unfairness of that. And so, the legislature for years has tried to deal with that issue. So what we did in Senate Bill 1 was to just cap it. It's a straight cap of 29 mills, saying that a community cannot charge more than that. And that'll help a lot of residents, especially in Hartford, where they have a mill rate of 74 for their cars. It's a number that is really ridiculous. So that's one thing. It's a straight cap on that. Two, there's a reform for new money for what's called pilot for payment in lieu of taxes. We don't have a lot of state-owned property. I don't in Norwalk and Darien, so it's not a huge windfall from that standpoint for state-owned property. The third part is something that I've been working on for a number of years, which is sales tax sharing. Because again, you hear, what is the biggest complaint that most people have for their taxes? It's their property taxes. And you talk to mayors and first selectmen all over the place, they'll say the only revenue they really have to offer or to get money from is mostly the property taxes, besides state aid, maybe some grants, but mostly the way for them to raise money is property taxes. Other communities across the country, some have local sales taxes, some have other ways in which they can raise money. In Connecticut, we don't have that. So we've been looking at ways in which we can help communities be able to provide some relief through property taxes, and the idea of providing 0.5% of sales tax through the region, through our COG, and then being able to divide that on a per capita basis was something that seemed to provide at least a majority of support amongst our members. And so for Norwalk, that would mean about $9 million of sales tax revenue per year, and that would also mean about $900,000 for sales tax for the town of Darien. So every town is a winner. There's no money that's taken from a town and given to another town. It's revenue that is in the region, sales tax revenue in the region, that would be given back to the communities for property tax relief. The last part of that is that we have a 2.5% soft property cap, meaning that if towns spend more than 2.5% of spending over the next year, which they could do, they're not prohibited from doing that, they could do that, but they would forfeit a portion of the sales tax sharing that they would receive. So other states and other states have hard property tax caps. We decided not to do that, but we said, okay, if you want this extra funds from the sales tax sharing, then you would have to keep your spending under 2.5% per year, or you would forfeit a portion of the sales tax sharing. So again, the sales tax sharing is something that I had been working on for a number of years, and I think that it is something that can be positive for our communities, and that will help bring back additional funds for education and for other things that can help, and also bring property tax relief for people who so desperately need it, and especially in our cities all over the place. Second question is on the budget. The budget did come out of, there was a budget that came out of appropriations, and a revenue side package that came out of finance. A lot of these things are what we do from the budget process, and we have about 3 weeks left of the legislative session. I feel confident that we will have a budget by the time June 3rd rolls around. We started discussions yesterday with the governor on it. The governor put his budget proposal in February. The legislature did their proposal a few weeks ago. The Republicans put their budget proposal as well. And, part of this is a public process, part of this is messy, but in the end, we will have a budget. And I certainly know that, the things that we think are important. For instance, the budget put money back that had been proposed for the hospitals, put money back in for things like the Mid-Fairfield Child Guidance Center, put money back in for STAR, put money back in for the Maritime Aquarium and stepping stones and other types of things that we think are important. Municipal aid has not been cut. Education funding has not been cut. So these are kinds of things where we all think are important, and we also have to figure out a way to pay for it. So that is for us what we need to be negotiating over the next 3 weeks with the governor. And again, I feel confident that we can do that.
Okay, before we move on, I was going to say, Terry, did you want to make a comment?
I do. Sitting on finance, I have another perspective on this that I'd like to add. On Senate Bill 1, it has changed, as Bob mentioned, and as Bob mentioned, it probably should not have come through planning and development at first. But it did come to finance. There was no language. There is still no language on the bill. It should be up within the next day or two, but still, to have voted it out on April 29th with no language was wrong, and that was the single reason we all should have voted against it. It was a party line vote. The $900,000 that Darien gets and the $9 million that Norwalk will be getting does come from the sales tax. It's a reallocation from the general fund. It'll be $400 million reallocated from the general fund. So we have to make up that money that went to would have gone to the general fund, that $400 million. That's part of why the taxes had to be increased by $1.8 billion over the biennium. The other part of Senate Bill 1 that has us greatly concerned is the section that deals with commercial and industrial property taxes may be, and I've forgotten, because we still don't have language on the bill, it's just what CCM and, somebody else did a quick synopsis of it. Say it again. Maybe CIA. The commercial and industrial tax bases in each community may be shared, optional, may be shared throughout the Regional Council of Government. And our concern 2 years ago about having these going to the COGS, the Regional Council of Governments, was just this, that all of a sudden our property taxes would be going from our local communities to the regional government to be reallocated to other areas based on a formula. So that's a concern. And to Bob's point, I think there is real value in looking at the mill rate on car taxes. It does seem a little out of balance that Hartford pays 74.29, and I know Norwalk I think is 22, and Darien is 15.01, and to do a common mill rate across the state. However, that should be looked at a panel. It should be looked at over a year and really do due diligence rather than just speeding this through with not much notice. I found out about this bill after it had a public hearing. So I think there's issues of transparency that bother me, and I'm hearing this from a lot of people. And then on the finance package 946, and as Bob mentioned, there are two sides that ultimately become the budget. One is the appropriation side, and the other is the finance side. And the finance bill was Senate Bill 946. That was voted out as well on Wednesday the 29th. $900 million of new revenue did not have a public hearing. And I know one of the things many of us, I know everyone at this table believes in, is the fair process. And everyone's voice should be heard. We all should have time to hear what some of these proposals are. Some of the new taxes are sales tax on CPAs, sales tax on architects and architects' fees, sales taxes. If you get your dog spayed, that's going to be a sales tax, not previously taxed. I've forgotten exactly how many, but it's a large amount. No public hearing on that. And the Democrats chose not to do that, and that's simply not fair. It's not the democratic process. So yesterday, the Republicans in Hartford, both the Senate and House Republicans, had a public hearing for the state. And there were hundreds of people that came. 5,000 people have signed the petition for no tax increases. And to sidebar for a minute, we all expect to pay taxes. We're all really lucky. As an accountant friend of mine said, he said, if you can pay taxes, you're lucky. But at some point, you have to look at equity and where are we spending our money in our state.
Can we, I'd like to move on, please. Excuse me, Fred, if you don't mind. I think we...
Well,
No, go ahead. I'd like to move on to the next question because I suspect...
I'd like to answer Dave McCarthy's question.
Okay. 1 minute, okay?
Because, I'd like to save the amount of time that the other speakers have had. This is an important issue. Yes, by the way, I thought that was an excellent question that was asked. On SB 1, it comes down to control. Who controls? You know, I think we all are big believers in town local control. Candidly, my experience going up to Hartford is the Democrats up in Hartford are doing everything they can to promote county government. And they'll come out and say, we need to have county government. So what we see are a lot of sort of behind the scenes, backhanded, indirect, nuanced ways to sort of tiptoe our way towards there. Because I think if we actually had an open public conversation about it, I don't think it would go very far. So on the car tax, that's one of the few things that cities are allowed to tax themselves. I haven't seen the SB1 language either. I guess my question is, will that still be under the control of the municipalities, or does the state control it and then give it back? The second area is with the sales tax. I've always believed that if we're talking about redistributing wealth, because that's what we're talking about, then you should let municipalities charge their own sales tax, and then the money comes directly to the municipality. But this is going through the state and then through a COG. And one thing that I've learned is that any money that goes through the state, if it's meant for a specific purpose, like gambling, remember it was supposed to be for education for the kids, it doesn't end up there. It gets swept up into basically balancing the budget. And so if we get promised $9 million today, will it be that way tomorrow, next year, 2 years from now, 3 years from now? Let's say we have another budget crisis. And that gets to my next point. We as a state are in a permanent fiscal crisis. And so we may get $9 million this year, but what about 3 or 4 years from now? And it shows up in there's essentially 3 budgets that are out there. First is the governor's budget. And let me just, I'm putting on my Board of Estimate hat here, and I can tell you that having the honor of serving this city for 8 years as chairman of the Board of Estimate, I can tell you that Norwalk's financial integrity and strength is head and shoulders above that of the state. Head and shoulders. And I've had the pleasure of meeting other municipal leaders and town leaders up in Hartford, and I can tell you it's the same way. Actually, I really think that the state could really learn from a lot of what we're doing here in terms of dealing with our financial issues. Because I tell you, there's very little financial integrity up in the state budget process. I mean, the budget, well, I'll just step back for a moment. As Congressman Heim said, we're supposed to theoretically balance our budget without borrowing money. We did that during the recession. We did issue bonds, borrowing bonds to balance the budget. So that is what we would call in Norwalk a gimmick. There's plenty of other gimmicks in the budget. As a state, as we all know, we're not growing very rapidly. If we had economic growth, that could solve a lot of problems, but we're not growing. Our revenues are flat. So in the governor's budget, he recognizes that, with revenues are flat, and we reached a point where we've run out of gimmicks that we can put into the budget, because I think there's consensus that we've really sort of tapped that area as much as we can. Somebody's going to have to pay to make the whole thing work mathematically. In the governor's budget, the people who pay are a lot of you in the room who provide human needs, human services, and higher education. You pay under the governor's budget to make the whole thing work. We decided in the Republican caucus that that was wrong. So our budget, and I've brought copies that's on the back table there, happy to email you our budget. We said we need to restore funding for the human needs and the higher education area. Who pays in our budget? The employee unions pay. And candidly, they have been a protected class. They enjoy benefit packages that are unsustainable in today's economy. And yet yesterday, there was a vote on appropriations for the educational assistance at UConn. They are migrating towards a more generous health plan under that strictly partisan vote. So here we are in Norwalk, we have either HSA medical or we have self-insured. The contract that was voted unanimously by the Democrats and unanimously against by the Republicans moves them off self-insured to the Connecticut Partnership Plan. So the world is moving in this direction toward HSA medical and more cost sharing. This vote moves in the opposite direction. And so we'll now move on. I'll move on to the third budget, which is the Democrats' budget. It's officially the appropriations budget, but I voted against it, and I respectfully don't see it as my budget at all. It raises taxes by $2 billion. In my belief, it'll put us on the path towards Illinois. It is so fiscally irresponsible. And who pays? We do, right here, the taxpayers. In particular, the taxpayers in Fairfield County. And it is my opinion that the Democrats in Hartford look at us as one big ATM machine. So whenever there's a problem, where they don't want to make hard choices on the spending side, just raise taxes. And they're thinking of us. And they do not believe that the cash will ever go empty in the ATM machine. So that's where we are with that. I wish I had better news to say, but I'm certainly doing my best to promote fiscal responsibility, to promote fiscal accountability, to stand up for taxpayers, to confront the central problem that we face, which we solved here in Norwalk and a lot of the municipalities have dealt with, and that's renegotiating the union contracts to make them sustainable and in line with the rest of the world.
So if I could, while you're passing the microphone, I just want to make the point that while it's very helpful to hear from the legislators, I think it's also important to hear from the constituents. So I want to make sure that we've only had one person ask a question, and I know it was an important question and multifaceted, but we do need some time to get some other issues on the table. Gail, please go ahead.
Thank you, Terry, very much. A lot of points that I would have made have been made, but I do want to return to one subject that I think hasn't been completely addressed, which is the issue of the spending cap and the money that has been recorded in the Appropriations Committee budget as off budget. Those are contributions that are made every year to state employee retirement and health care benefits programs. And there's about $2 billion that has been taken off budget so that the majority legislative budget can fit under the spending cap. There are some pretty grave implications to this. And I think that in looking at any budget, we all need to be aware of what those implications are. The spending cap was something that was proposed and accepted on a statutory basis back in 1991 when Connecticut first instituted the income tax. The reason was that taxpayers obviously resisted the income tax a great deal because they felt that there would be no limit placed on it. They could eventually be asked to pay more taxes than they could afford. So the spending cap was a way of stemming that. There was a constitutional amendment proposed, and it was supported by 83% of the people who voted that year. The parameters of it remain to be implemented by the legislature. More than 20 years have gone by, but we still have the statutory spending cap. The problem is that when you redefine the cap and you take money off budget, I put that in quotes, the money is still getting spent. It doesn't count as part of the spending cap when you're calculating how much the state can spend, but someone still has to pay for it. That doesn't change. So taxpayers are still paying for it, and that is completely over what the spending cap calculation, it's really a tax cap because it calculates either, consumer price index or inflation, whatever is greater, how much taxpayers can afford. So this automatically means that they're paying more than that. And it all comes back to something that's procedural in the General Assembly. When I was on the Wilton Board of Finance, we used to give a revenue recommendation, how much we thought the town could afford, how much its taxpayers could afford, before we actually heard the spending recommendations. We gave guidelines to the Board of Ed and to the Board of Selectmen. The state does it the other way. It says we got to spend this much. Okay, we're going to find the revenue somewhere. So that's a problem that is front and center in that budget. And I think that in the current state, as it is before us, it really is unsustainable. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Gail. And I think many of us in the audience can relate to that because our businesses, we can't just generate new revenues. We have to work at that, and we contain our costs before we start spending that money. Brian, can I ask you to see if there's anyone else? Anyone? Doug?
Good morning. Doug Hempstead, Vice President with Stu Leonard's, also a Common Council member in the City of Norwalk. Just real brief, I am also opposed to SB 1. That's from not my Stu Leonard side, but my city side. Mr. Duff, and we very respectfully, I know for years you've been trying to push for an X percentage of tax come back to the cities that have sales tax, Norwalk being one of them. I say simplify the bill. 0.5% of tax, either the city of Norwalk gets to charge it, or the state imposes that and imposes to send it straight back to the city. We don't need another form of government passing it through. So if the goal is to get us 0.5% sales tax back to Norwalk, then let's just get it directly back to Norwalk through the state and let them collect it. Norwalk does a fine job. I don't see why we get penalized for municipalities upstate and mid-state that can't handle their own budgets, all right, who get a significant amount of education dollars, all right, and can't control their spending. Norwalk, again, does an excellent job. But I'm going to move on to a bill that's important to the company that I work for, and I know many other businesses in the area, which is Senate Bill 1044, which requires employees with 500 or more employees or franchises whose local franchise collectively employ 500 or more employees to pay $1 tax for per hour work by an employee that pays less than $15 per hour. Doesn't distinguish between part-time, full-time, doesn't distinguish, except there's some exemptions for parks. I don't know why the state wouldn't want to exempt itself with parks and all that. If a 15, I don't understand the logic behind the bill except to raise more additional taxes in a very convoluted way to fund welfare issues or what they're saying low-wage earners' needs, when that was what all the syntax and the gaming devices we put in originally and keep trying to grow was supposed to take care of. This puts an undue burden not only on, it can put it on some municipalities who have summer help, it also puts it on a variety of business owners throughout the state. And it shows no distinction between if I'm paying somebody minimum wage or I'm paying $14.25 an hour. All right? I want to understand the bill and the reason actually for it, and if the state is saying in the language that these are low wages and $15 an hour seems to be a supportable wage for earnings for a household, then why doesn't the state move forward and have the courage to stand up and say, we're going to make the minimum wage $15 an hour? Because all this does is put tax revenue, and this is a way of saying one thing, but not in actions, but in turn become a collection agent for a penalty. And it's not even on the sliding scale. I need to understand why this bill is even taking place, let alone have they understand the impact on major corporations, major companies, and considering it's part-time labor also, and that can be summer kids' jobs. Now you can have adults trying to compete for jobs with kids if they have to pay $15 an hour. Somebody can help me out with that. And 946 is another bill which concerns me because that's a corporate tax.
Okay, thank you. Who would like to take that? Senator Duff?
Thank you. First things first, I don't support just having Norwalk add an extra 0.5% of sales tax on their own. I don't think that with the small municipalities that we have in the state, 169 of them, I don't think that is good policy to have Norwalk do another 0.5% on the sales tax when you have some of the same stores, Norwalk and Stamford and other parts. So I think the idea of putting money into, sending it to the region, having that money go back on a per capita basis is probably the fairest way of doing it so that it provides Norwalk with the most revenue. On the bill you just talked about, Councilman, I can't give you a lot of chapter and verse on it. It's not my bill. There's 187 legislators with about 2,500 pieces of legislation that get introduced every year. I don't think that the bill is going to come up for a vote this year. What I do know about it is that the genesis of it is the fact that there are large corporations such as some of our fast food restaurants, some of other places that tend to be franchises that sometimes are low wages, and where those employees are then either part-time or they're full-time, but they don't make enough money to be able, or the company doesn't offer health benefits. So therefore, they apply for the state's health benefits, and it's a drain on taxpayers because of the fact that now you have people who are working, but not working and making enough money in order to be able to get their own health insurance or pay for their own health insurance, so they have to go to the state to pay for that health insurance. So who pays for that? We do. So I think that's the genesis of the bill. I don't think it's meant to punish corporations or stores like Stu Leonard's or others that actually pay health benefits, that have other types of benefits as well. But I think it's looking at corporations or businesses that don't pay enough, that put people in a position where they have to be on some sort of state assistance because it's there, and then it's basically a bait and switch from a standpoint of the company where we have, again, think of some of the large franchises that have lots of profits, but they're not paying into healthcare, and so they put it on the state burden to do. But again, I don't think that's something that's going to come up for a vote this year.
Okay. Other questions? Jerry?
Good afternoon, everyone. We could debate all of the various issues on many of these bills as we have at the Chamber and other organizations that I belong to, but the legislators have limited time. So I'd like to look at a very simplistic view, maybe because I taught math to sixth graders 4 decades ago. So please, on the panel, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that about 70 to 80% of the budget is non-discretionary. Those are the fixed costs of government. So 20 to 30% of the expenditures that the state has to make are somewhat discretionary. And even if you were able to cut those, like 10% or 20%, which would be devastating to those agencies and the places where that discretionary spending goes, it's only a small fraction of the total budget. So it would seem to me that the problem we have is not being addressed, even though we raised over $3 billion a couple of years ago, and we're now talking another couple billion. We are going to be in this room 2 years from now talking about the exact same thing. We'll have to expand the breadth of who we tax, and we'll have to increase the amount that we tax. But I believe there's an economic principle that if you regulate something and tax something, you will get less of it. So we are already a disaster in terms of our competitive ability in the country, our state is. So if we don't cut regulation and cut the size of government, I don't see how we get out from under this problem. So rather than taking the time at this point to discuss each aspect of the bills that are really trade-offs between how we get screwed. It's not even, it's just how much and how. So if each of the legislators would possibly just give us a short comment as to whether they agree or disagree, are we going to deal with the structural problems that cause all these discussions? And if so, what's the solution? Are we going to deal with state employees? Are we going to deal with the size of government? And I don't mean taking down the rate of increase. I mean, are we actually ever going to address the problem and shrink the size of government, shrink the need for revenue, shrink the taxation, which is chasing people out of the state?
So it comes down to sustainability. Terry, did you want to take the first crack at this?
Yes, I will, and I will try and keep it brief because I think all 6 of us should answer this question. I remember sitting in finance 2 weeks ago, public hearing. The policy analyst for AFSCME, which is one of the big state employee unions, was answering questions and gave his testimony. And one of them was, I want to see tax loopholes for the rich closed. So I asked him, I said, just give me 3 loopholes you would close. He couldn't name them. So there's a lot of rhetoric behind the state employees union. The next senator asked him, are you aware of how many people are leaving the state because of tax reasons? And this same union policy analyst said, they're not leaving because of tax reasons, they're leaving because it's cold. I kid you not, and that is on record. The driver I see, one-party rule in the state of Connecticut is not serving us. And I consider myself a social democrat, but a very strong fiscal Republican. I think most Republicans and most people in our state are socially moderate to socially liberal. Social issues are not driving our state. It's not even part of the, well, it is part of the debate, but it's bipartisan. The fiscal issues, to your point, Jerry, are driven by the state employees union. And unless we make structural changes in those agreements, modifications, not eliminations, we are not going to advance as a state. And when I talk about state employees union, I'm not talking about police officers. Those are public sector union members, and that's something different. And teachers should be paid more, quite frankly. So I'm not including teachers in these comments, but people who work at Department of Motor Vehicles, the DOT, Department of Social Services. I see this every day on Human Services. Department of Social Services, Department of Revenue Services, 45,000 state employees, guaranteed jobs, no layoffs. Their health care benefits, they pay 11% of the care of their health care. In the open market, it's about a $33,000 a year plan that they're paying $3,000 for. When they retire, that plan, bless you, when they retire, that plan is either free or up to $35 a month, and they retire after 20 years.
Can we?
So, and
I'm sorry,
I think what's frustrating for us is we talk about this, and the debate gets trivialized because you hear the opposite. The Democrats say, well, we can't balance the budget on the backs of the workers who deliver great services. Nobody's saying they don't do a phenomenal job. Well, some maybe don't, but most of them do a good job. But that trivializes the debate. It's about equity. The humans with the Child Guidance Center, those with their point of service contract from the state, they get a 0.25% increase a year in salary. The state employees delivering the same services, 3% a year. That's not equitable. So those same human service deliveries, the dual delivery system in Connecticut needs to be adjusted. Again, not eliminated, but adjusted. Thank you.
Yeah, Jerry, it's an excellent question. I'll keep my remarks short. It seems like in the last 20 years in Connecticut, we've been focusing on how to redistribute wealth, and we've kind of forgotten how to create it. And I would like to, I'd like to see us growing and winning again. We're in a slow, no-growth situation. So we're in a fiscal crisis because the structural costs that you talk about under the union contracts, they have binding arbitration. So if you're a union employee, you have binding arbitration. You have a legal status superior to anything else. The taxpayers don't have binding arbitration. If you work for Midfield, the senior center, or if you work for a not-for-profit, you don't have binding arbitration. No one else does. So I think what a lot of the towns have done and what we did here in Norwalk, a fair way to address this issue, all new hires go on to private sector benefit plans. HSA, high deductible medical or self-insured, 401k style pension plans, and no OPEB, no post-retirement liability. We did that here, it's been done here in Norwalk to great success, and a lot of other, again, mayors and first selectmen have done that in their towns. Current employees, since they've been made promises to, they can keep their plans, but they got to pay more. And just by doing that, it will be enough to turn the ship so we get away from these permanent fiscal crises, because I think someone made a point. We will be here. If we don't make these changes, we will be here 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now. We'll be hearing about funds being swept out, money that was promised to us not showing up, because we're just, insanity is doing the same thing, expecting a different result. And we need to start doing different ways of showing up. And this is one way that can work and address the structural issues that were mentioned.
Okay, Senator Duff would like to weigh in, please. Go ahead, Senator Duff, go ahead.
I know the hour's getting
We are
late.
running out of time.
I just wanted to mention that, right now, we do have 5,000 less state employees than we did 4 years ago. We have made a conscious effort, and I'm not saying me, the executive branch, made a conscious effort to hire less state employees and to do more with technology and to do more with less. As I said yesterday, I don't know if anybody goes into the motor vehicle department saying, geez, that was a really fast process that I got in and out of. But with the technology upgrades there, with the technology upgrades hopefully will continue to happen over at the Department of Social Services and other places, we will get using more from technology. I do also want to mention that, the governor 4 years ago did open up the contracts with state employees and change the health and pension costs for the state employees, which will save about $21 billion over 20 years. That has been that is fact, and that's been projected out, and it's actually happening right now. So there is savings that way. Plus, they have a few zeros, and they are slated to get some increases over the next few years. But I will say that part of this also is that what we talk about with the state employees is the fact that you have to really rewind the clock back 20 years. When the original agreement was made with the State Employees Union and Governor Rowland, who made an unprecedented 20-year agreement. And when we came into the Great Recession, Governor Malloy opened up those contracts again with a threat of layoffs in order to get another tier of state employees and to get more health and pension reforms so that employees do pay more. I will say this, here's just a few other things that we're not talking about in the budget right now. One is that we had over 46 contracts come up for nursing homes that if they went on strike, it would cost the state $20 million. And we're providing them in the appropriations budget with a half percent increase, which costs us about $9 million. We also now have to, Judiciary Committee approved a settlement yesterday that finally brought an end to this 12-year drama when Governor Rowland illegally laid off state employees because he didn't do it across the board. He kept state police on, he kept others on, and he laid off about 2,800 employees, which, by the way, never saved a dime. And thanks to the Attorney General who negotiated the settlement's going to cost us about $125 million instead of over $300 million, which, by the way, would have been due and payable in 30 days. So this $125 million settlement, which is fairly complicated, will be paid out over personal time and vacation time. So we'll probably net out going to cost us about $40 million all told. So, those are some of the things, too, that we have to deal with from our state budget. But from the standpoint of state employees, I don't think he gets enough credit for changing the health and pensions. And, maybe some would argue that there should be more, and that's a fair argument to make. But to say that nothing has been done is just not true.
Okay, thanks. Ed, I'm asking the boss, are we out of time? One more question?
Terry, I'm so sorry, but we really would like to respond down here. I'm so sorry, but it's.
Okay, so then you'd rather talk?
Yeah, I would appreciate you would.
Okay.
Thank you, and I will keep it short because my comments are going to be exactly, that's why you're the senator. We're going to be exactly his because I didn't expect this to be as much of a partisan type of discussion here today.
Neither did I.
And I really did want to hear from you, the businesses. I wish we were able to have been able to spend more time to hear from you and what's going on. But we cannot balance the budget on the backs of the union employees. I'm sorry. Governor Malloy already went to the well, as Bob said, a couple of years ago, got them to open up their agreement, and already got the concessions from them. So quite frankly, one of the budgets that was alluded to today that has those concessions in them, how are you going to get them? The governor already did that before. So I would say that budget that's out there that's depending on using $600 million or so of union concessions that they have no ability to get or no agreement that they're going to open, I would seriously question whether that is filled with any gimmicks or not. We need to learn something from this recession. We need to learn something. I like the words that you used, Fred. It's about the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, looking for a different result. Well, guess what? As a result of the recession, I think we have a governor and a legislature that, yes, it is dominated by Democrats that made certain that within the last 8 years, despite what was going on in the rest of this country, all of our cities were kept whole. Our cities were kept whole. We invested in education. We made strategic investments when other people were deciding, no, we're going to cut, and those states aren't doing better because of those cuts. They're doing better because nationally the country is turning around. But what should we have learned? What should we have learned? And it goes back to my earlier comments. We have unsustainable expenses. There's two parts to the budget. Number one is the revenue side, and that's what got all of us in trouble. The revenue side was what hurt us as a state. We lost the financial services industry. So we need to do something to make that up, and hopefully over time we're going to rebuild that back up. But the expense side, the biggest expense side, wasn't just the workers, and I think we've taken our pound of flesh from them. They worked real well with us. The other part of it was the prison, what we're paying in prisons, what we are paying in social services year after year after year. No, sorry, decade after decade, right? Because we deliberately select and choose as a state not to empower our entire community. If we're talking about there's a revenue problem, we should want to make certain that there's job growth throughout the entire state of Connecticut. All boats do rise when the tide rises, and we're very deliberate about doing that. So I have a challenge when we have certain bills that come to the floor and they get thrown aside. This is, listen, you got a parent that's on TANF. Well, you know what? If you're not working the full 20 hours or whatever it is, you shouldn't get TANF. When someone says, listen, I want to allow that person to use 10 hours of college time to apply towards that work. You say, no, that isn't good. Why wouldn't I want a single mom to better herself if she's doing something, going to college and getting an education so that she's more employable? I want her just to go back and, work at McDonald's and she can't afford to pay for to pay for a family. She's working 2 or 3 jobs. That doesn't make good sense to me. Okay? Why would I want to continue doing these tough on crime bills that are charging us $45,000 to $50,000 a year per inmate? Per inmate, and we're only spending an average of $12,000 a year to educate. Everybody knows it. But why have we not learned, coming out of this recession, that's where we need to be focusing our efforts to make certain that the human potential that exists within the state of Connecticut, we are tapping into it and making certain that we are getting our return on investment from every citizen. That's where we need to be. Move past these unsustainable expenses, and I'm going to end it. Because 50,000, you said it very well, 50,000 employees, we already cut 5,000. I agree. There's some nicer things that we could do to make things more in line with private sector. But guess what? Bob said it well. That has to come out of a negotiation. It has to come out of a negotiation. Governor Rowland, and he was not a Democrat, as we know, because I don't want to go partisan, but it was a Republican governor, quite frankly, that made that agreement, that stuck us in this 20-year fix. It is a Democratic governor who got it opened up and got it worked out for us, if you want to go along partisan lines. Okay?
Representative Martin, thank you very much. It is 9:38 right now. Gail.
Thank you. I'm really disappointed to hear my good friend and colleague, Representative Morris, talk about this getting too partisan. Unlike Washington, here in Connecticut, we don't argue about all of those social issues, as Terry said before. We generally work pretty well together, and it's a pretty civilized atmosphere up there, and I have to say that. In fact, the whole protocol is organized so that it remains that way. We have some major differences. That's why we have a two-party system. We have to acknowledge it exists. Those major differences chiefly concern financial matters and things that involve unions, particularly public sector unions. Governor Rowland is someone who it's nice and convenient to point to because he's a Republican and he did some things none of us liked. And I remember in 2004 when I was not involved in politics being asked in Wilton if I would support a town resolution to ask him to resign, and I did. These things happen, and it's really unfortunate. There's some people who do things that aren't very good. But it's kind of like what were the parties doing during the Civil War? Well, I don't think anyone was very happy with what the Democrats did then, but if we point to that now, we're not looking at the current situation. We have a situation that we have to deal with now. And the important thing for us to look at is what we have and what we can do about it and how to fix it. It doesn't matter who did it because we had a Democrat legislature all that time or we had a Republican governor. All of them made mistakes. Sometimes you don't see those until you have hindsight. I'd note also that Jody Rell opened the contracts at one point. This is something only the governor can do, by the way. The legislature, that is not a legislative branch function to do those negotiations, sign those contracts, and open them for negotiation. So, yes, we have made a recommendation that we hope that the governor will consider. Let me tell you why. Right now, with all of the tax increases that you've heard about and things that taxpayers would be asked to do, in other words, pay, state employees are being given, under the contract, raises of $350 million. That's not benefits, that's just the wages. $350 million in raises over the next 2 years. Also, last December, the governor announced that he was giving raises of between 3 and 12% to 200 political appointees in the government. And when you look at that, it's hard to rationalize saying, all these folks are getting all these increases, but taxpayers are going to have to pay for it lock, stock, and barrel. Taxpayers, there does seem to be an attitude in some quarters that there are two things that are not good. Taxpayers, because they don't want to pay for anything. Well, you can't do anything without them, so at some point you have to be nice to them. And the other thing that isn't nice is employers, because they don't pay their employees enough. Without the employers, nobody would have a job. And I remember when I was running a subsidiary of the Interpublic Company in Paris for 5.5 years, I had employees, and they were my only asset because it was a service business. They weren't exactly an asset. They were an asset in terms of getting things done, but of course we didn't own them. However, I knew that if I wasn't decent to these people, and I didn't reward them properly, and I didn't force them to come in when they were sick, I didn't want them in when they were sick, if I didn't do all those things, they would leave and go somewhere else. Any good employer knows that. Any good employer is not going to treat his or her employees unjustly or badly. So I will end by just a couple of things. Fred said earlier that Connecticut is in a permanent fiscal crisis. I don't want to take anything away from Fred. He will agree with me. That is actually a quote from the governor's budget director, Ben Barnes, who said Connecticut is in a permanent fiscal crisis. And he also said one other thing, and this is the governor's budget director. He said, you know, if you put too much tax pressure on the people who are providing most of the revenue in this state, and by the way, there was a study that 37 of the richest people in Connecticut left would lose about 30% of our tax revenue. If you put too much pressure on them, they are gone. So we have to be very careful, because all those services that we want and all of that quality of life and that education that we value so much in Connecticut, we will not be able to pay for it if taxpayers are pressed to pay more than they can afford. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Connecticut being in a permanent state of fiscal crisis, the Barnes quote actually comes from a guy named Fred Carsons, and he's an economist at UConn. He's been studying this, our state's economy, for a long time. There are a couple of issues. First of all, I don't think that taxing people, our population, indefinitely is sustainable. I think that our structural problems are real. I think that if and we've got real trend line problems. Basically, if we don't do anything structurally to change this, we are going to be strictly in a service economy in 20 years. This terrifies me. So my focus, and I think a focus of a lot of people in the legislature, is, Representative Lavielle was talking about, Interpublic. The fact is, it's a good company. I work there too. The fact is, your most important asset is your people. How are we investing in our people? How are we used to manufacture things very well. There is a growing manufacturing sector. I believe it's coming back in our state, advanced manufacturing. But what are we doing to align the interests of the kids coming up to go into those jobs? You're looking at the state of Virginia, where kids coming into 9th grade, they're already being talked to by guidance counselors to consider going into manufacturing as a viable six-figure income career going forward. We have an alignment problem in the state of Connecticut. Basically, our assets, what we have to offer is not aligned, I think, in any way strategically with our budget, which has been my issue with all of these budgets, is that we are doing what we can to cover costs, and granted, we can talk about what we want to do, but none of them are looking forward to the point where, my satisfaction, it's giving us an offense. It's giving us a growth rate that is going to help us not only create jobs, but also create the kind of economy that we need beyond a service economy going forward. And I think that's where all three of them are lacking. So I think if I have anything to close on, I think one of the focuses has been for me is to say, look, we got to get Connecticut working again. We do that by really putting our money, targeting our investments where we think we are going in the areas where we think our state is going to grow the best. About whether it's manufacturing, education, to make sure that we have the talent pool to satisfy the needs of a lot of companies that want to move here. And I think that's been an area where we've fallen short. So you've had a great debate. Frankly, I don't think it's been all that partisan. I mean, we disagree. That's our job. And I think that this has been it's crazy to think that we wouldn't come to a Chamber of Commerce meeting and get called to the carpet on tax policy. That's why we're here. So I just want to say thank you for just having a great debate. And again, we're all very accessible, and we all work really well together. And I think that's been one of the things that I think are looking forward. I mean, we're competing with other cities that have large legislative delegations to work together, and I think this is something I hope we keep doing well together as well. And again, thank you, Chamber.
I just want to say thank you to the people that are still here. I just want to remind ourselves that these are our legislators, and the citizens of Norwalk elected them. I'd like to thank all 6 of you for being here this morning, and remind all of you in the audience that they are our legislators. They're here to listen to us. So please make sure your voice is heard. Thanks everyone for coming, and have a great day. Let's go build that economy.